I come to the kelp world from the art world, and I got my MFA from San Francisco State in the early 90s. And so I was trained as a photographer, and then started making books and realized that the writing, the combination of word and image is really where a lot of the power lies in kind of telling these stories. And then have become more and more involved in the kelp world, the bull kelp world in particular. So what I thought I'd do is share my screen and take you through my journey as an artist into the science of seaweed. We'll just get rolling here. So again, thanks. We had a wonderful session last week at the California Seaweed Festival up here in Tiburon. I don't know if any of you guys missed it. This is a little bit of a recap of that presentation. But it was absolutely one. There were tons of grad students, especially highlighting the students in the CSU system. There were local people involved with seaweed and food, and this idea of bringing art and science together really plays across all these different constituencies and is really a powerful vehicle for telling these seaweed stories. And this is what I've been doing for many years now. So I have been making images of the marine algae using my flatbed scanner, and I'm able to translate these images into all sorts of different formats. So I have gallery shows with fine artwork on museum walls and in galleries. But what I've come to really appreciate is printing these scans of the seaweeds onto this fabric that allows me to translate the seaweeds into so many different forums and spaces. So usually I actually am pretty assiduous about actually naming the seaweeds as I go through these talks. We have erythrophyllum and egregia and palmaria and giant kelp or macrocystis. And often I'm really talking to a much more public audience. You guys are probably all pretty well versed in the seaweeds, I would guess. So I might skip over that side, but it is important to me to have the names there. This was an installation in a really underused shopping center in Alameda here in the Bay Area. And the Alameda Arts Commission invited a bunch of artists to try to enliven this space. And this was an old video store, which needless to say had been empty for many, many years. It probably still is empty, but this was the storefront that I was given. And then there was a whole festival. There was food trucks and dance performances and children's performances and other artists' work in this space. And so the great macrocystis got to be a backdrop for that. And this is from this very recent exhibit that I hope if any of you are in the Bay Area, you're able to get up here to downtown San Francisco at 836M Gallery. And afterwards, as we get into some questions, I can drop that in the chat. You can make a reservation to have a visit. It's been a wonderful bringing together of a number of us artists who really forefront bull kelp as a central organizing theme to an art exhibit. So it's 5 women artists from the Bay Area. And this is one of the chief pieces that holds down the exhibit. That is, again, these fabric banners that allow light to come through and show kind of the glory of these organisms that we're all really pretty fascinated by and intent on kind of trying to bring to this broader audience. And I'll talk a little bit more about that exhibit later on. So how did it begin? Well, it began for me quite a while ago. In about 2009, I was working on a book called Beach, a Book of Treasure. And I'd done a number of books already, one on beach stones, one on seashells. And I really wanted to focus on the beach as this portal into the ocean world, this space where beachcombers, people who are not divers, who might not have the chance to go snorkeling, get to encounter the ocean world. And it's really through what we find at the beach. And I was training to be a docent up here on the Duxbury Reef, which is our really fabulous tide pooling up here. And went out with a group from the California Academy to learn about the rocky reef ecology. And what I found is that everyone was talking about not what I was seeing the most of. There was a lot of talk about the nudibranchs and the starfish and the sculpin fish and the crabs and the limpets and all that. And yet here I looked down and all I saw was algae and no one was really talking about it. And I held a scrap up to the sky and I was like, oh boy, I have to get this back to my scanner into the studio. There's been a lot of energy since then on the marine algae, and that's been a great, really a great delight for me to see evolve. These kind of underrepresented organisms begin to get the spotlight that they deserve. So this is the scanner in my studio. It's right here next to me where I'm sitting. I've had the same scanner for many years. I've actually got a slightly updated model, but it's no better than this one. So to capture this the seaweed and get the transparency, I actually use this upper section of the scanner that has that white cover on it. And I take the white cover off and there's a second light element up there that when I lower it down, I might use some of those stone helpers so it doesn't smush my specimen. That's that light element in the top part, the transparency adapter actually pushes light through my specimen as the scan is being captured. And then the scan comes right up into Photoshop, and I work with it either there or in Lightroom. And then if I'm building a book, I'll be working over in InDesign. So it's this very kind of smooth workflow that I have between the organism itself, the scanner, and then my digital design, imaging and design world. So here you have some beautiful erythrophyllum. You can see that I scan it either wet or dry, that there's some of these nice little wet puddles that are from the water. And then I also have really worked on these more abstracted collages using the specimens themselves. So you can really always see what organism I'm actually using. Here is some Maziella and erythrophylla mixed together with, I think, a little Prionitis in there to give this incredible, lovely variations of purple and brown. So here's the great Halosachion or sea sacs. If I'm giving a talk to a classroom of students or others who are really interested in the nearshore ecology, I will talk about strategies for surviving this funny world that is the intertidal zone, where these organisms' atmosphere, if you will, the ocean gets kind of sucked away and comes back twice every 6 hours. And that we have a hard time envisioning that. We can't really imagine our atmosphere getting sucked out and coming back twice a day. And that these sea sacs actually hydrate from within, which is a very different strategy for success than the more folio seaweeds that dry out. And here I'm really reveling in the forms and colors that these seaweeds are presenting to me as a designer. The incredible Maziella volans really are these funny spoon-shaped species in the Maziella genus. They're that crazy color purple, and to pair them with the whimsical Agresia pods from the Duxbury Reef. And you can see this was made way back in 2013. And when I was doing talks in that, I was like, the seaweeds really need to be more popularly out there. They're so beautiful and they're so, they're revealing a world so unlike ours. They should be on cards and posters and tea towels. You get ferns and you get mushrooms and heirloom peaches on tea towels. Why not seaweeds? And by golly, at the Seaweed Festival, there was a woman selling seaweed tea towels. So we've really come a long way in 10 years, which is great. And my artist's eye and my artist's kind of sense of play gets to work with this incredible diversity of forms and shapes and colors. These are 2 historical scans of Gloeosiphonia that I kind of put together. These were pressed in the 1880s, so I had access to the UC Berkeley's herbarium where these historical pressings are. And then I overlaid some other seaweed color on them. And this is a print that is up. It's, I think, printed on metal in a couple of different hospital installations. And the great Egregia or feather boa kelp, Egregia menziesii, has really been a favorite. My beach that I walk here in San Francisco is Fort Funston. It's where I really go to connect to the ocean on a very regular basis. So a lot of my specimens are just picked up having washed up at Fort Funston, as was this one. And it's just such a jazzy, it was such a fabulous specimen. Egregia is one of those organisms I know that I have to get onto my scanner pretty quickly because it goes kind of dark and it loses its fabulousness once it's dried. And I also tasked myself with Egregia, was the kind of story that I chose when I was developing the proposal for the Curious World of Seaweed book, to see if I could write an essay about the natural history of the feather boa kelp and the history of the science that was really entitled Empathy for a Kelp, this organism that's so unlike anything that we recognize from our backyards, from our terrestrial world. Could we go into its world and where there, you know, the power of gravity isn't so important, something that we've internalized so profoundly, where again, it lives in this intertidal zone that's so, so that was, in any case, that was the first essay of my book, The Curious World of Seaweed. And I also, Egregia really gave me kind of a new way of thinking about making some artwork. I really wanted to play with this idea of abstraction. And so I actually was gaining inspiration not only from the Egregia, but also from a local artist, Rex Ray, here in San Francisco, who very much walked the line between graphic design and fine art. And he would make these wonderful, exuberant collages using these organic shapes that he would cut out of this patterned paper that he would make. And I thought, well, I could use the Egregia blades in the same way that Rex Ray was using his pieces of paper. So that kind of inspiration comes from all over. And then I made an ongoing series of these abstractions, really trying to play off these amazing color combinations that the seaweeds offer us. And again, another example of how I can scan. So this is nori, I really, you know, nori is the one seaweed that people in a really popular way, people understand that we eat it, that it's part of this kind of broader culture, not only the Japanese culture, but the native Californian culture, which is really, this is the kind of most common edible seaweed that is recognized kind of across the board. It has this really broad array of color. I was able to scan it both wet, as you can see in these dusky green leftmost scans, where you can see the reproductive elements are all around the edges, and then these dried, deep purple nori dancers, as I call them. So as I was really working on scanning these seaweeds and researching the science behind them, I started doing a lot of workshops with Kathy Ann Miller, who, as you all know, I hope you know, is the curator of algae here at UC Berkeley. And UC Berkeley's University Herbarium, it really has the repository of algal. It's the algal herbarium that really has collected the holdings of all the marine labs throughout the West Coast. And I also was running into doing research into Anna Atkins, because Anna Atkins was really one of the foremost or one of the earliest advocates for the seaweeds, besides outside of the William Henry Harveys that were actually describing them. And Anna Atkins was a Victorian polymath, a woman with many, many talents, who made the first photographically reproduced book. And that book was of her collection of marine algae. And it was made up of these cyanotype impressions. So the cyanotype technique is a kind of nascent photographic technique whereby paper is coated with a light sensitive emulsion. And it's a combination of ferric compounds that produce a UV sensitive emulsion on paper. And when you expose it to sunlight, the part that is getting hit by the UV goes to blue, and the part that is shadowed by your specimen gets washed out in the water wash that you wash it with after you've exposed it. So I thought, oh, I could make, in Anna Atkins's honor, I could make some cyanotypes myself out in my backyard. You can see the cytosiphon here on the right, and a combo that I've made in my computer over on the left with some of the halosachions there in the shadow. And as I was making these cyanotypes in my yard, it's a very slow and contemplative process. I realized that my own scans are actually operating in this same historical lineage as the cyanotype printing, which is this lineage of nature printing, whereby the print is made from the specimen itself directly. It's not mediated by a botanical illustrator's hand or the lens of a camera. And there is this whole history of nature printing where actual specimens were like put through the press. So I thought, oh, wouldn't it be cool to digitize my cyanotypes and then have the scan of the same specimen? It's all one-to-one in terms of scale, play with its shadow. So I did a whole series of these my own kind of cyanotype impressions, where my own contemporary scans are in dialogue with this historical process. And there's this kind of connection between past and present. So this is a Puntiella californica, and it's this brilliant red. It has these kind of mouse ears. Again, this was just found in the rack. But in a whole slew of red seaweeds, the Puntiella kind of stands out because its color is just that much different. This is quite a mature piece. And this is one of the more recent interplays of the cyanotype with my scans. And this is called Chasing Kelp, where I've really interlaid a whole series of bull kelp blades and either pressed or whole bladders with a cyanotype from a bull kelp specimen. And bull kelp is really where my work is going now, but I thought I'd just take you a little bit into the story of getting to the curious world of seaweed. These are 4 of the incredible lithographs that are from Ruprecht's folio from 1853, where he was describing the 5 or 4 iconic kelps, no, 5 iconic kelps, because Postelsia isn't in here. You have on the left, you have the Stephanocystis, which used to be Cystocyra. You have Dictyoneurum, Pterygophora, and then on the right is the Egregia. And these are these long unfolding panels in the back of his little pamphlet from 1853. And for me, the fact that the taxonomic record has this incredibly robust visual component was really fun and makes the history of the science not only part of my essay writing, which it very much is in the Curious World, but also part of the image making and part of the research. It's kind of where it all begins. This is me overlaying a scan of a Costaria costata on its cousin, the Dictyoneurum. And then you have a scan of Pyropia or Nori onto the great, one of these great lithographs by Alexander Postels from his folio Illustrationes Algarum. And you guys are in Southern California, or many of you, I think, and the Illustrationes Algarum folio, the actual elephant folio by Postels and Ruprecht, is in the Special Collections Library at USC. And so it's really worth going over there and arranging to view it in real life, because it's just extraordinary. So it took them about 3 years to actually digitize it on my request. And then I got to work with those images. So this is that Stephanocystis with its lithograph that I kind of switched to the blue. And then this became the cover of the book. I build the books as I go along. I'm kind of mapping text and image into a layout that becomes bigger than the sum of the parts, I hope. And then I get to work with the art director and designer at in this case, it's Heyday Books here in Berkeley. They're a wonderful nonprofit publisher. So there are 16 chapters in The Curious World of Seaweed, each one hitting a kind of iconic California or West Coast kelp or seaweed and touching on different topics. But I like to say that these 16 chapters is just a tiny, tiny fraction of the incredible richness in the algal flora of our West Coast. And I'm up in Northern California. And so I kind of like to explain, why is California so rich? We know that there are plenty of whales and sharks and plankton and fish and such, but the flora is also so rich and diverse because of this amazing upwelling. And the upwelling happens because we often in the spring get these enormous winds. And this is me taking this picture at McCarricker State Park up in Mendocino. And if you were up there this spring, you knew that the winds did not stop. It was very, very windy. So these spring winds are pushing the surface waters away and allowing the upwelling, the deeper, richer, nutrient-dense waters to come up to the surface. And so those nutrients are, and cold waters are as important for the algae in the near shore as they are for all the marine life that is offshore. And if you're on the shore, like I am, and many of the people that I know that really are kind of beach watchers, you might encounter this kind of richness in the algal detritus that gets pushed up on shore. And there's just this richness of pattern and color and shape and smell. If you actually get close enough to it, you'll see all the kelp flies, and this richness then will translate, and carbon will translate up into the nearshore ecologies. But it also gives you a sense of the diversity of the seaweeds. And so this is a chance to kind of explain the three evolutionary lineages that are the taxonomic groups that we use today, which is the greens, the reds, and the brown. And you all really probably know and are going kind of deep into the science of the pigmentation of the seaweeds, but I like to highlight how resourceful they are. You know, that we as humans are so used to red daylight in terms of it being the norm. We don't realize that it's actually a very specific wavelength of light that doesn't necessarily penetrate the ocean waters, and that the reds and browns, that the greens gave rise to our terrestrial plants, and that the reds and the browns have these accessory pigments that allows them to collect different wavelengths of light. And that's these really remarkable kind of resilience and strategy and resourcefulness that the seaweeds are showing us. So there's a whole chapter on color in the book, and I use Maziella here as my kind of signature for that chapter. When it dries to this perfect purple that is this real combination of the red and blue accessory pigments that are what make the red seaweeds that incredible array of magentas and purples and deep reds. I have a chapter on the coralline algae, of course, because they are so important. And what I find is that once you kind of show people what the coralline algae is, they'll notice it. It's very small and fragile in the rack line, but it's usually always there. So you have the encrusting coralline on this incredible bottle that Kathy Ann Miller, this is from Kathy Ann Miller's collection, and she has allowed me to scan and show and exhibit. And then the articulated coralline, and this whole strategy towards avoiding herbivory by calcifying in your cell walls is just something that, you know, is a wonderful way to talk about the seaweeds and their variety of how to survive in the intertidal zone. And there's a chapter on the seagrasses. These are some of the Zostera specimens that Kathy Ann Boyer allowed me to take from her tanks at her lab here at San Francisco State's labs at the EOS Center. And I talk about Phyllospadix too, of course, the seagrasses. But I want to get on to the bull kelp, because this is really where I'm putting my energies now. The bull kelp is the second chapter of the book. And as soon as that book came out, COVID came down and we all kind of got stuck in our studios. But I realized that this bull kelp, so much was happening as regards the bull kelp on our Northern California coast, where the kelp was declining rapidly, and that story was just coming about to a broader audience. And yet, if you went up to British Columbia, or even to Oregon, Puget Sound, Southeast Alaska, and Alaska, very different stories were playing out as around the bull kelp, but with the same cast of characters. So I use bull kelp as a really nice way to go through a life cycle of one of these, iconic organisms of our coast. These are two wonderful, wonderful historical specimens of these babies, and how I can emphasize that the bull kelp does all of this growing from those tiny little organisms where the bladder is as big as your thumbnail to this majestic organism in just a few months, to really emphasize that it's an annual species, and that the power of sunlight and these nutrient dense waters gives rise to this enormous amount of biomass in just a few months. So Marco Mazza has these beautiful photographs of the bull kelp forest in the springtime, as these bladders are trying to get those blades up to the surface to be as efficient as possible in photosynthesizing. And then as an annual, of course, it has to reproduce before it gets torn up by the winter storms. So these are some of the sori patches, these patches that evolve on the blades of the bull kelp during the course of the summer, so that by late summer, each of these patches might have millions and millions of spores, and they drop away to the ocean bottom so that they can then reproduce in about the same environment as the plant that it came from. You can see where the sori have started to pull away. And I just, as an artist, I just love the abstractive possibility of these sori and this incredible halo that the cells at the edge of it create as they're about to give way. So these are prints that are part of a larger exhibit called The Curious World of Seaweed, and give you a sense of kind of my sense of wonder, even in the deepest nooks and crannies of the kelp life cycle. So what is up with our kelp on the North Coast? And I like to show these three images to kind of tell in a very visceral way that kelp has been incredibly abundant on the North Coast. And this is Van Dam State Park in 2008. 2008 is often used as this kind of baseline year in these graphics that are used to talk about kelp decline. But I like to point out that 2008 was this apex of an apex year of kelp abundance. So bull kelp is naturally incredibly cyclic in its abundance. It goes in kind of 3-year cycles, typically. Of abundance and then decline. And this in 2008 was really a biggest of the big years. And this is my friend Larry Knowles, who's a kelp harvester up there in that year. And the photographer Ron LaValle, who took this picture, has since died, passed away, which is very sad. He lived right there near Van Dam State Park, which is right on the way to Mendocino. And I was up there in 2017 also with Larry. We were going kayaking and then snorkeling. And this is in that same kelp bed, of course, a little more spread out. And then in 2019 and 2020 and 21 and 22, I go up very regularly to Fort Bragg to snorkel up there. I did talks at the Noyo Center for Marine Science. I was shooting the kelp story up at Mendocino for the Earthshot Prize in 2021, or was it, yeah, in 20, or maybe it was 2020. No, it was 2021. And I would stop at Van Dam each time at this same pullout and take this picture. And this is what you see. You see no kelp at all. And what struck me, especially that first time in 2019, was it was so beautiful. And every time I've stopped, it's so beautiful. The water is very clear. The coast is just stunning. The sand is white. There's usually kayakers going out. So there's nothing to tell us that anything is wrong with this image, unless we know that these kelp are missing. So remembering what we're forgetting is really part of my work now, in terms of not only telling the bull kelp story of why it's missing, but how do we keep these, the stories going, and these locations where kelp has been, keep it in memory. So this is the typical story of the urchins eating the bull kelp. Urchins are voracious kelp eaters, herbivores, and many of these kelp forests up on the North Coast have flipped regime to urchin barren. There's that lovely abalone there. And what are the factors that have given rise to these urchin barrens? Was these, I'm sure you've all heard this, the ocean warming events in 2015 and 2016. We had the starfish wasting disease. This was a piece I made that's printed on a big aluminum panel of a whole collection of culled urchins from the North Coast. They were sent to me in a box, and none of them broke, actually. So I piled them onto my scanner and made this. It sits very large. So there's actually an urchin image in there with the seaweed images. And this was a piece I made as a kind of homage to the kelp on the North Coast, where I'm including Alexander Postel's amazing kind of crown of the big bull kelp with my own ghosted out version. So one of the reasons we don't have kelp on the North Shore is that the top predator has been gone for a long time, the sea otter. And throughout my work on the kelp forest, the sea otter story has been really interesting in how in Northern California, it generally was dropped out of the story until recently. It's kind of creeping back in, mostly to some of our efforts. We're constantly trying to make sure that in Northern California, people remember, even though there are no sea otter there, many people don't understand that there have been no sea otter in Northern California for over a century and a half. But that they were part of the evolution of that ecology. And of course, they are voracious urchin eaters, as well as the Pycnopodia sea star, which died off with the starfish wasting disease. So it was interesting at the Seaweed Festival, there was a lot of talk about the starfish hatchery. I guess you'd call it a hatchery up at Friday Harbor Labs, where they're really researching how to bring back the sunflower sea star. If you go up to Kodiak, to Alaska, the sunflower stars are not rare. I saw 4 of them in one little cove that I was snorkeling in. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is what we're dying to see on the California coast. And so there's interesting conversation about these strategies for recovery. And one of the things that I'm finding really interesting in my role as an artist is that it's really, really important to keep your ear out and be privy to all these conversations and to see who's promoting what. Like, the Nature Conservancy is doing great research. They're funding this research into the Pycnopodia recovery. Would the Pycnopodia on the North Coast have enough, would they have the same problem that sea otter would have if you put sea otter back into the North Coast, where these urchins just don't have enough food source in them to support these top predators? That's a real problem. But it's a very interesting story, and all sorts of efforts are going into kelp recovery. So this is really where my efforts are going now. It's into this entangled world that is the mysterious world of bull kelp. And the idea is, can you take the story that involves this kind of cast of characters that is the bull kelp as protagonist, urchins, abalone, sunflower sea stars, and then, of course, humans. We've been involved in this ecology from time immemorial, and our relationship to these characters has shifted and changed and had enormous impact on the kelp forest, as the fur trade exhibits, in that we killed off the top predator very early on, that had enormous impact. So this is my idea for this next project, this mysterious world of bull kelp, is that we look at the range of bull kelp, which goes from really San Luis Obispo, is some of the historic kelp beds of Nereocystis, go all the way down to San Luis Obispo, and then all the way up through the Pacific Northwest, through BC, Canada, and the Southwest Alaska, and into Western Alaska, and off into the Aleutians. And the Aleutians these days are having, huge ecological crisis. And is that story being told enough? Is that final kelp bed in Umnak Island that was written about by Kathy Ann Miller in a paper in 1989, is that kelp bed still there as the westernmost extent of the bull kelp range? These are all questions that I think would behoove everyone who's studying bull kelp wherever they are. And the idea was that each of these regions could tell could take on a different part of the story. In Southeast Alaska, there's lots of kelp farming going on, and farming bull kelp has not been such a commercial enterprise, but it's starting to be experimented with as perhaps a resource for restoration. So one of the ideas was to go to these places. So here I am on a Algae island. I went up to visit there in the spring. A friend of mine is an archaeologist, and his sister and I are good friends, and we went snorkeling. And just being in the intertidal zone, deep tidal zones off of Kodiak and Afognak was just so fabulous. Everything's big and wide, and the bull kelp was just coming up. But a point in fact was that when you are kind of trying to get a sense of an abundance or quality, say you're mapping the kelp, which has become this, huge endeavor right now, is to map the bull kelp to see where we are. Well, it really, really makes a huge difference what time of year you're mapping or you're looking. And this was, it happened to be a good time to go, was Memorial Day, last week of May, first week of June. And so the bull kelp were just coming up, and these were quite shallow. They weren't the deep beds. We could sense some of the deeper beds. But my friend Patrick, who we were visiting, who lives there and is out, he, as I say, doing these archaeological surveys, he wrote me at Labor Day and said, oh my gosh, the bull kelp beds are just in full force right now. And I wasn't quite seeing that in June. And despite flying over quite a lot, you go by plane everywhere. So you get to fly, you get to tell the pilot to say, could you, fly over those kelp beds that I've been looking at on a map from 1912, these historic kelp maps, and see if those beds are there. Well, in June, it's hard to tell. It would be much easier. And that's true for any kind of mapping of the kelp. What quarter of the year are you looking at? So that's been one of the kind of issues, one of the aspects of this project, this Mysterious World of Bull Kelp, was to see how could I look at these historical maps and work with contemporary maps that are being done now. And the Kelp Watch, incredible Kelp Watch site, has definitely been on my radar to kind of give this contemporary mapping forum. And this is a historical map from the coast of Mendocino. You see Saunders Landing. This is Saunders Reef, which is really quite a famous reef right there. But this is a continuous line that I have of these kelp squiggles that, if you're deep in the NOAA website looking at nautical charts, you're always looking for the kelp squiggles. And I've highlighted this one here that continues for mile after mile on this, from the Sonoma coast up into the Mendocino coast. Yeah, it certainly is not that continuous line today. And again, trying to parse historical mapping data, I went to the California Fish and Wildlife data from their aerial kelp surveys from 1986 to 2016. And I kind of stuck them into that QGIS, open source GIS program, and was really looking through them year by year. And each year seemed to be at a different time of year. The polygons seemed to be not necessarily related one-to-one in how they were mapping. And so I kind of gave up and said, let's just use them as a beautiful resource and make some interesting imagery. This is for the Monterey Peninsula in particular, and this was a specimen of bull kelp from the Monterey Peninsula that I made this cyanotype from and overlaid onto that GIS data. This is the Oregon coast. So here, this is me searching for those kelp squiggles and incorporating some of those historical 1912 charts with some earlier 1800s nautical charts. And then the yellow and blue are the nautical charts that we recognize if you're a sailor, as I am. Certainly that yellow and blue is, you know, before the electronic navigation, you always had your charts with you. But again, I didn't feel like I could come up with any real information out of these charts that was meaningful in some way, except for that it was there at this time and place when these mappers happened to go by, whether it was by boat or otherwise. And this is a map from these historical charts that I have been referring to from 1912. And I've actually overlaid the 1880s chart of that Saunders Reef here with the 1912 kelp maps. And these were a series of maps that were commissioned by the Department of Agriculture in 1911 and 1912. And they decided that there was real commercial value to the kelp beds off the coast of North America. And it was when potash from Europe was becoming very expensive. There were world wars and there was problems, and potassium for fertilizer was in great demand. So the possibility of these kelp beds as a great resource, American resource, wanted to be assessed. So the Department of Agriculture made these beautiful maps between 1911 and 1912. And so this is bed number 35 was the Saunders Landing bed. But one of the most important things about those historical maps is what is written and highlighted behind this chart. And it reads here, it happens that this year, 1912, was an unusually poor one for a kelp harvest, as will be explained more in detail. Most of the beds were thinner than usual, and especially along the North Coast sections. So what they do, he talks about the sources that local seamen asserted, and the Coast Guard people and the lighthouse keepers and the local fishermen were all saying 1912 was not a good year for kelp, that in fact, kelp is very cyclical in its abundance. And so what I've overlaid on this kind of summary note is this chart made by Meredith McPherson from her paper published in 2021 that's using the Landsat and satellite data to really assess kelp abundance. And what you see is, and that she assessed that from 1984 on is when we have really reliable satellite data that's usable, and that this is this cyclical nature of bull kelp. And you can see if you go up to 2008, it's this gangbuster year that everybody is always comparing our current kelp situation to. But you do see from 2015 to 2020 and ongoing in 20 to 22 that kelp, we are not seeing that rise again in kelp abundance on the Mendocino and Sonoma coast. This is all just for bull kelp. So you really, to assess, and my kind of and this cyclical nature is not only for kind of the coast in general, but it's also for each individual bay or cove where you have a kelp bed. And so you have to actually go there to see how the kelp is doing. So that's kind of one of, again, this Mysterious World of Bull Kelp project is how do we go and talk to the people who are working in each of these regions and become really connected to them to assess how the kelp is doing in their particular space. So I got to go up to Mendocino and snorkel up at Portuguese Beach in this kelp bed. This was April, and I got to do this for the Earthshot Prize segment, Revive Our Oceans, and represent the kelp forest and make sure the kelp forest story was in that pretty cool BBC series that was narrated by a whole bunch of interesting people, as well as David Attenborough. And the kelp of Northern California, as was photographed here and put together in that, was really representing all of the kelp forests around the world, Australia, South Africa, where kelp is in steep decline and is really trying to be studied. So so this was spring. There were all these kelp babies coming up to the surface, and of course I had to swim back with a bunch of little kelp specimens that I brought back, and I kept having to tell the the cameraman, please photograph the kelp, don't photograph me. This is the story of the kelp. Let's keep the kelp as front and center of this storytelling, which as a writer, as a photographer, as an exhibit curator, is really one of the things I keep coming back to, is how do we make sure that the bull kelp itself remains the protagonist? It's not about us, it's about the organism. Even as we try to save our planet, let's keep the organism as the central focus of the story. So I scanned those 3 little specimens that I brought back from Portuguese Beach and then translated them into these banners that you see here. That is the intro or entrance to this exhibit downtown, which is really called Kelp. And I think I have a picture of it, but it's, again, me really trying to say, how can we tell this kelp story of a particular place? And that I know these 3 kelp babies, bull kelp babies, are from Portuguese Beach, from this kelp bed. But I don't really necessarily know that the maps of that kelp bed are going to tell me the full story. And is there a different way to characterize what's happening in a particular place to the kelp beds? And this is kind of a very, very first go at this idea of a kelp index. And might we be able to develop some kind of a graphic that would, in a glance, tell you who the players are? So I'm, for example, using Port Orford here. And if you can see over here on the right, I have the 1912 map of the Cape Blanco and Orford Reef here. Beds number 11, 12, and then number 13 is at Port Orford. And down below in the blue map is the Kelp Watch map from the 3rd quarter, the most abundant quarter of, I think, 2021. And you can see there's only these tiny little specks of green there. But there's so much I don't know from those maps. And would there be a way to characterize the Orford Reef in a way where you could see the proportion of kelp to the proportion of urchin? You could see that otter and sunflower star and abalone might be players in the ecology, but they're not in the circle right now. They're ghosted out. This is, again, a very first pass at this idea. I mean, literally plonked on the page. And so you're seeing my kind of brain in action right now. And I'm working on this with my partner, Mariana Luschel. And as we work through some of these ideas, but that you would include the fishing interests and the tribal interests, and who's in the game there at Port Orford. I have on the left all these different words for bull kelp, this idea that the kelp can be named. It has all these different relationships to it that are not just the scientific community, that's well beyond the scientific community, and that those relationships are also really important and are kind of as important to be forefronted in the storytelling of this ecology. So this is the exhibit kelp that those 3 little bull kelp are the intro to, and this is what I hope you all can come to see in San Francisco. You can make an appointment at the 836m.org. I think it's 836mart.org. I'll put the link in the chat. Where a group of us artists have really centered the bull kelp. And we've realized that making a space like this, that it brings this wonder of this nearshore ecology in this dynamic way, has allowed us to schedule all these other events around it. So we had a very robust opening. Everyone was so glad to gather. We had a blue food event in the space where all sorts of different food vendors got to talk about their connection to the kelp forest and their efforts to be part of restoration efforts. And then we just had last week a policy panel in the space where the specifics of kelp restoration was talked about by a representative from California Fish and Wildlife, the marine sanctuaries, and the Nature Conservancy. So the state, the feds, and an NGO, and how they're all really working together to try to cooperate and collaborate on making the best tools available and the best science to bear on actual kelp restoration. And that the art space can become that forum for conversation, to me, is just really thrilling. And part of Mariana and my goal is to actually take this exhibit on the road and make this kind of a space available in other places where the conversation, up in Oregon, where Tom Calvanese is doing so much work with the Oregon Kelp Alliance, trying to do the science to do kelp restoration up there. And is there a way to bring the public along with those by forefronting the local artists who are involved with kelp? So that's kind of our we have some big goals around this art and science idea. And that's kind of what we're doing between this and the website, the Mysterious World of the Kelp Index and the Kelp website, which is where we're at with their my bull kelp story. So this was an early wanting to highlight 5 foundational kelp. This piece was actually inspired because I was asked to submit a proposal for a mural in a renovation of the Hastings Law School, and Hastings Law School has a preeminent ecological law program, environmental law. That's, sorry, I had a little brain dump there. Their environmental law program is very strong and robust, and I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool for a program that had this strong program to have the foundational kelp that you're looking at, as opposed to, say, founding fathers or something like that. Well, that program stalled with COVID. I'm not sure what's happening with Hastings Law School, but this was a slide I just received yesterday. I'm sorry, it's a little dim, but it's an installation of these 5 foundational kelp up at in Sydney, British Columbia, which is right adjacent to Victoria. It's where you take the ferry from Vancouver when you're going to Victoria. And there's a wonderful aquarium and science center there called the Shaw Center for the Salish Sea. And this is the exhibit space that looks right out at the Salish Sea. So I've created these custom banners of the 5 foundational kelp, and they just hung, this show just opened on Saturday. So the director just sent me these slides, and they've actually projected some of these images of the fish in on the kelp. So this suggestion that the kelp forest, in a very visceral, visual way, that the kelp forest is what is responsible for this richness, for the health of the fish populations, for the whole ecology, for even our human cultural richness, is kind of, for me, symbolized in this one slide. And I couldn't be happier to be experimenting in this visual realm with all these different groups, like this, the aquarium, the Salish Sea, which is very connected to the First Nations, and bringing their story into the seaweed story. And so from there, I'll just show you a few of these images that are, for me, really about the richness, the abundance of the flora at our ocean's edge. And I'm able to translate these images. Well, number one, they look great on the screen because this is its native environment. These are digital images first and foremost. So they look really good as a projection, but then I just have taken them down as a fine art triptych, a very large triptych, and that's actually in my garage now. So if anybody wants this image as a big 52-inch high triptych, please be in touch. But they've been in a number of different art installations over the summer and through into the fall until now. Here is one of these Ocean's Edge groupings. This was the installation of the 836M gallery. And so from the outside of the space at nighttime in particular, these glow up in this clear story. So it feels like the seaweed is up above at possibly what could be thought of as the surface of the ocean. And then I really, at the beginning of the pandemic, I did something I've been wanting to do for a long time. I kind of picked all the shekels out of my couch cushions and went to my local foundry and took one of my seaweed squiggles that I pick up off the beach and had it cast into a piece of bronze. I then worked with the foundry chemists who do the patina and gave it this great, incredible patina that kind of felt like it might be how the bull kelp felt. So one of my great kind of long-term aspirations is to find a situation where we could, where we could cast one of these really big, get the funding and the place, something like an Academy of Science where children and grown-ups are interacting outside, and there would be this enormous cast bull kelp that you could climb on and interact with. But because I don't have that big of a commission, I'll show you this one, which was this really great project where we were able to bring the bull kelp to life at this huge scale. And this was just this past summer up at Lincoln City in Oregon, when the really low tides were happening in July. I was asked to come up and be part of this Art on the Beach program that was just in its second year. And the Cascade Head Biosphere Reserve is the peninsula. If you look way up at the top of the right-hand picture, that beautiful, beautiful peninsula is the Biosphere Reserve, the Cascade Head Biosphere Reserve, and the group of artists and ecologists that manage that started this Art on the Beach program to get people involved, to get passersby and the public to be able to react to something that's just right offshore. It's right off the coastline there. And the first year they had gotten an artist to do some diatom diagrams that they had drawn out. And this year they asked me to come and let's do the kelp forest. So I did a very kind of rough sketch, and I was inspired by the kelp I had been snorkeling in at a fogneck, that it has this, that it's the bull kelp in particular with the current has this incredible directionality to it. And then I got to partner with these amazing artists, especially this artist, Frank Boyden, that I'm pictured with here on the left with that big, long drawing tool that he has. He's a world-renowned ceramicist. He's an amazing draftsperson, and he was able to translate my sketch into the outlines that we then, and a whole bunch of us volunteers, had with our rakes, and we raked them out. And then a drone was sent up, and the kelp forest was captured, complete with its sori there. So this is really the translation of the drawing to the actual kelp forest on the beach, which includes the sea otter. So we partnered with the Algae Alliance, and it turns out one of the interns of the Biosphere Reserve, or from OSU, actually did the drawing of the sea otter, and then that was translated into the sand. And then this also was the opportunity not only to engage with the public on the beach, who were asked to join in and were told, you know, what are you doing? And then you get to go on and on about the kelp forest. But we also had a art workshop. We had a cyanotype workshop, and we had a symposium and talk with me and the Algae Alliance, talking about the kelp forest, in particular off the Oregon coast there. So I partnered with Tom Calvanese and got some of his slides to be able to talk specifically about what's happening to kelp on the Oregon coast. So this was really a wonderful, wonderful way to bring art and science together, and for me to collaborate with other artists, which was so inspiring. And their work is ongoing, and we just had a ton of fun. So I'll finish there, and I hope that there's time for questions. If you want to get in touch with me, these are my books, The Curious World of Seaweed. Please, if you don't have it, yes, do get it and read it. It's got a lot of good history of science, and especially women pioneering phycologists. So I really, just every chapter has somebody amazing in it that was really kind of augmenting our understanding of the oceans, and they are mostly women. And so I'm at Josie Iselin on Instagram, and drop me an email, and my website is there. So maybe I should just stop sharing and we could get some questions.